Hello everyone and welcome to another tutorial on NGUI. In this tutorial I'm going to start from a beginner's point of view and finish by creating a draggable scroll view that can be resized and can have draggable items inside of it that can be moved from one scroll view to another. I'm also going to go over some of the features that were recently added to NGUI in 3.06 and 3.07. But before I get to all of that, I'm going to start at the very beginning and assume that you are fairly new to NGUI. If that's not the case, my apologies. Now, if you are a beginner, it's actually a pretty good starting point to open up the first example that comes with NGUI. You can do that just by searching for example in project view and opening up the control widgets. This scene right here actually has a bunch of widgets that I've simply dragged and dropped into the scene. They're control prefabs that essentially come with NGUI for all the basic things that you might possibly need, like scroll bars, sliders, drop-down lists, checkboxes set up into a radio button group, and so on and so forth. You can play with all of this, of course. But we can also just start a brand new scene and build up to something like this. So here I have a brand new scene. Let's start by adding a button to it. I'm gonna search for button. And I'm just gonna drag and drop the color button prefab right into the scene view. And I'm gonna drag in another one as well. So now I got two buttons. If I happen to drag a button, you will notice that it actually snaps to that of its siblings as well, which makes it easier for you to position things if you so desire. If you don't like this functionality, simply hold Control while dragging and you'll be able to align it exactly how you see fit. You can make the button bigger at any point by dragging on one of the handles. You can also rotate the button, or any widget for that matter, just by holding the mouse right outside of the corners or sides and just rotating it like that by holding the mouse button. Again, if you don't like the snapping to specific angles, hold Control and you'll be able to fine-tune your choice as you see fit. Holding Control while outside of any movement operation also let you see the dimensions of the widget that you currently have selected. And you can also modify it, of course, and see the effect right away. Or you can just adjust it in the inspector. If I want it to be exactly 250 by, say, 60, I can do just that. And yes, if you hit play at this point, you can actually interact with the buttons. But what is a button really? You might have noticed that although there is a sprite in the inspector, there's nothing related to text itself. That's because in NGUI, everything is made out of either sprites or labels for the most part. And the actual behavior that makes this a button is scripted on top using UI button script. The text for the button is actually on a different widget. You can see it by expanding the prefab. You can see that there's a label and then there's an overlay. You can select it in the hierarchy view, or you can actually click on the button a second time and this will actually select the topmost object, which in this case happens to be the label. You can also right-click on the button, or any widget for that matter, which brings up a context menu. To select something specific, open up the Select submenu and choose the sprite that you want. For example, the overlay sprite. So to modify the text of a button, select the label and just type in your new text. Like so. So how about we start with the real basics here and actually create a button like this from scratch? Well, you can actually select the root right-click and create a widget of your choice. In this case, let's start with a sprite. Now that we have a sprite, we need to choose an atlas for it. In this case, I'm just going to select the wooden atlas. And I'm going to choose a specific sprite. I am going to go with, let's go with a window. Now, if I was to stretch the sprite, you will notice that it stretches evenly, because it's just a quad. I can change the type of the sprite to be sliced, which will essentially change how it works. You can always preview the actual geometry by switching this mode to textured wire, for example, and then you will be able to see the exact triangles that get generated. This is what a slice sprite does. It keeps the corners fixed size and sides fixed size along one dimension, while the center actually resizes freely. It's ideal for creating things like buttons, window backgrounds, and so on. Well, now that I have a background for this button, let's create a label on top of it. I'm going to create it as a child, and by default it's going to be difficult to see because I have a bright label on a bright background. Now you have two choices here. You can adjust the color to something darker, or you can actually give it an effect, like a shadow effect, which makes it a bit easier to see, or an outline effect, which makes it a lot easier to see. If you want a beveled-like effect, switch to shadow mode, but then change the effect color to something brighter instead. Let's make the actual color of the widget darker so you can see it better. And the background as well, just a bit darker. There, now you can actually see that beveled effect coming through. But in any case, if you actually were to type a lot of text here in the button, you will notice that it starts shrinking. Chances are this is not what you want. Now you got two choices. You can actually resize the widget yourself, or you can actually change the overflow mode to something else. Resize freely, for example, will change the dimensions of the label instead of having you adjust them yourself. Clamp content will essentially cut everything that doesn't fit. If you want to restrict the number of lines that the label has, you can actually choose it here. Now I only have one line, the maximum, but I'm just going to leave it at 0, which means unlimited. Although currently the label is a child of the sprite, if you happen to resize the sprite, the dimensions of the label will not change. If you want the dimensions of the label to be associated with dimensions of the outer sprite, you can actually use the anchor system. Switch it to unified, and by default it'll be anchored to the dimensions of the parent. To make it be centered at all times, just choose the center for each of the anchor point. Now if you happen to resize, the parent is going to behave exactly as it did before, except now I can actually change the pivot point of the parent without having the child move around. Here, let me show you what happens when I get rid of the anchors and then try to change the pivot point. If you actually want the label to actually resize with the dimensions of the parent, change it back to unified and specify the same exact sides. So left, attach your targets left, right, to targets right, bottom to bottom, and top to top. Now if I was to resize the parent, you will notice that the label adjusts itself accordingly. Of course, you can fine-tune the selection at any point to make it be exactly what you want. We will examine anchors in greater detail in a little bit. For now, let's get back to making a button. If I hit play right now, it's not going to be interactable because we haven't done anything with it yet. To make something interactable, all you need to do is give it a collider, like so. Now it will be able to receive events. But unless we actually write a handler script to handle the events like onClick, onDrag, and so on, it's not going to give us any benefit at this point. So let's go ahead and attach a button script. You will notice that the attach menu is actually expanded now. Before there was only one choice, box collider. Having a box collider gives you additional options. So let's start by adding the button script. Right now, if I hit play, this will actually act like a button. By default, the button script will assume the sprite that it's on as the target. If you want it to be something else, like for example, if you wanted the text to be highlighting instead of the background of the button, just drag and drop the label into the target field. Now if you hit play, you'll notice that it's the text that's changing the color, not the background. If you wanted multiple objects to get highlighted, you can just attach multiple button scripts. Now that I have one button referenced in the label and one button referenced in the sprite, if I hit play, both of them will change colors. But in this case, it's not what I want. I'm going to get rid of the one that colored the label. To make this button play a sound, just search for play sound and add this component. You'll need to specify the audio clip to play, for example with tap. And you can specify what the condition is to trigger it. In this case, it's going to be on click. Now if I hit play, there's now going to be a sound on click. Well, let's make this button look a bit better by giving it a tiled background like the other buttons have. You can actually right-click and create a new sprite. I'm going to add as a child again. And in this case, I'm going to specify a tiled sprite. Say this one. Nah, this one. Now there's a problem. This sprite happens to be on top of the text. That's not very good. Let's fix that. Now the order of things is defined solely by the depth property. If you select the label, you will notice that its depth happens to be 4, while the depth of the sprite is 5, which means that this is actually on top. If I was to switch them around, now the text is going to be on top. Now I want to specify a tiled background. If I do it just like so, you'll notice that it's not exactly tiling at this point, it's just stretched and it looks pretty ugly. That's because the sprite type is sliced right now. I'm going to change it to tiled instead. Tiled actually tiles the sprite. You can also choose a filled sprite, for example, if you were making something like a cooldown timer, or something, say, like a progress bar. It's up to you. But in this case, let's stick to a tiled sprite. Of course, if I want it to be less noticeable, I can change either the color or the alpha. Or I can just choose a different sprite that is less noticeable to begin with. Like this one, for example. That's a little bit better. I'm gonna make it a bit darker as well. Like so. It looks nice. Now I know those of you who are artists are probably screaming, "No, it doesn't!" But I'm a developer, so to me, everything looks nice. Anyway, on this sprite, let's also anchor it using unified coordinates, and it happened to choose the right ones this time, so I'm not going to touch them. Of course, if I modify the size of the parent, the child will get modified accordingly, which is perfect. Now, if I am happy with this button, I can actually save it as a prefab. It would probably help to name it. And then I can just drag and drop into any folder to create a prefab out of it, just like with anything else that comes with Unity. Now, if I was to drag this into the scene, it'll create another copy of the button. So how about we make these buttons actually do something? We can actually do that by attaching a tween, for example. Say I wanted to have a tween position. What tween does is actually tweens the object's position from point A to point B over a specific amount of time. So in my case, I'm going to position it where I want it to be, and just hide all these components so they don't get in my way and I can actually see correctly. So the X position of -257 from 2, I'm just going to change the Y. Say I wanted it to be -100 when it finishes. Right now, if I actually hit play, you'll notice that the button moves in place. If I don't want it to play right away, I can simply disable the tween position component. Now if I hit play, it'll obviously not do anything. But the good thing about buttons is they actually allow you to trigger tweens, among other things. All buttons actually have an on-click notification here, which is built into the button component. So let me rename this guy so I can actually find it easier. If I wanted clicking on this button to trigger the tween on this object, I can simply specify, where's this guy, tween button in the notify field, and then choose the function that I want executed. In this case, I wanted to play forward, for example. Let's see what happens when I hit play and click on this button. Nifty. Let's make a second button play that tween in reverse. Same thing. I'm going to drag the tween button into the notify field and choose play reverse as the target. So now if I hit play, hit on the first button, click on the second button, they actually move the object around. But what if I wanted this to happen when I hover over a button instead of when I click on it? Well, I can actually do that by attaching another play component, play tween. Play tween has more options than just the on-click notification. In fact, you can actually specify what triggers it from a list of options. And now that I look at the list, I notice that I forgot to add a couple on drag primarily. I'll do that in a future update. Well, let's choose on press, for example, and see how that behaves. For the target, I'm going to choose the tween button and hit play. When I press, it moves down. When I unpress, it moves up. If I choose on hover instead, it's going to be the same thing. but with hover. I can also chain events together. Let's change the duration to be 0.25, so it's quarter of a second, and change the curve to be like so. So it's actually nicer looking. Let's test it. Yeah, a bit more presentable. But what I want to do is actually duplicate this button. Control D, duplicate, and move it just beside here. I'm gonna change this guy to be 2. This guy is 1. What I want to happen is I want to trigger this button first, and once this button's tween finishes, I want this button to move. Now I can actually do that by specifying the onFinished callback. So for the right button's onFinished callback, I'm going to specify the left button. And just like in the buttons case, I can specify which function to call. And I'm going to specify play forward. So now on this button, if I happen to reference my right button instead, change it to on click. If I hit play and then click on this button, they're gonna move like so. Of course, I should probably modify the tween starting position a bit so they're not on top of one another. This one seems to be 127 and minus 49, so let's change that. 27 minus 49 to minus 100. This guy minus 49 to minus 100, and its position is 377 now. Okay, let's try this again. Click on a button. Yeah, that's more interesting. I can also change the tweener playstyle as well. So if I was to do a ping pong, for example, on the second one, now if I hit play and do this, it's just gonna keep moving back and forth. Well, I would say we have enough awesome buttons here. Let's do something else. Let's create an actual window. I'm gonna delete all this stuff and start from scratch. There are some shortcut keys with NGUI that you probably should remember. Alt-Shift-S creates a sprite, for example. Alt-Shift-L creates a label. Of course, you can do the same thing by right-clicking, but personally, I like the shortcuts. So it's up to you. I'm gonna go ahead and create a sprite. And I'm again going to choose the window, and I am going to create a resizable window. Now to create a resizable anything, all I need is a sprite. Say in the bottom right corner, I'm just going to choose the resize icon sprite. Simple type. If I actually click this snap button right here, it is going to change the dimensions to that of the original sprite, making it pixel perfect. And just to make it easier to see, I'm going to make it black and move it down a bit. By the way, when you're actually positioning something like this, you can also use arrow keys, just like in Photoshop. Doing so can easily fine-tune your selection. So here I have a sprite in the bottom right corner, and I want this sprite to resize this window I've created. To do that, first I need a box collider so it is able to receive events. Now that I've done that, I also need to attach a script to resize the window. I can do that by right-clicking on it and attaching a drag resize script. Here I can actually specify which pivot I'm resizing. In this case, it's bottom right, and the minimum and maximum allowed size of the sprite that I'm actually resizing. For the target, I'm going to specify the sprite. And if I hit play right now, I will be able to resize the window, but the sprite is not gonna move with it. Let's fix that. Anchors to the rescue. Unified, and by default it automatically attached to the top right, bottom right corner, because that's where it happens to be. Now if I hit play again and drag it, you will notice that it stays in place. You know what would make this cool? To have an actual scroll view inside this window. Well, let's do that. To add a scroll view, right click and create a scroll view. Now you actually have an additional panel here which can be resized. I want this panel to be a child of the sprite, which I'm going to rename to window. So I'm just going to drop it as a child. Just like if it was a widget, I can actually anchor it using unified coordinates. So now, if I was to resize the parent, the scroll view will also resize. Of course, you can't really see it in action because there's nothing inside the scroll view just yet. Let's fix that. Let's add some sprites. I'm going to create a sprite, and well, what would be easy to see? How about the NGUI symbol? So there's one, and as I drag, you will notice that it actually fades out. I'm gonna give it a collider. Oh, and by the way, Alt-Shift-C is the shortcut to add a collider, so I don't have to do it through the menu. And on this collider, I'm also going to attach a drag scroll view. It's up here. Now, if I actually hit play, I'll be able to drag this object around in the scroll view. Easy enough, right? Let's duplicate this guy. Control D, move it to the right a bit, duplicate it again, move it to the right some more. Now we actually have several sprites and we can see it scrolling around. Of course, since this is a resizable window, you can also adjust the dimensions at any time. You have a resizable scroll view. If you wanted to click on an object and actually have the scroll view automatically scroll to it, you can do that by attaching another script. Select the panel, right-click, attach center scroll view on child. Now this doesn't need to be on the panel per se, it just needs to be on the container object that has all the children. So if you happen to have a grid object here and underneath you have all the children, it would be placed on the grid object instead. But since I have all the children directly under the scroll view, I just placed it on the scroll view. So center child, center on child. By itself, if you actually hit play right now, it will make it possible to automatically center on whichever child is closest to the center of the scroll view. You can also use this to create paged views, by the way. If you flick it past a certain threshold specified here, you can actually make it go to the next page. But I haven't specified it. Anyway, what I want to do is to be able to click on the object and it will actually automatically center the scroll view on it. To do that, I again right-click on the sprite that has a collider and attach center scroll view on click. I'm going to do the same thing for the other two. And now when I hit play, I can actually click on the item and the scroll view will automatically scroll all the way to it. Well, let's make it even more interesting. Let's make it possible to drag these images outside of the scroll view using drag and drop. For this, I need a couple more things. On the background sprite, I need to add a drag and drop container. That would be this script right here. Now, it actually expects a reparent target, which is what the object that's being dragged will be reparented to. In this case, it would be the scroll view. So I'm going to specify the scroll view. Although now that I think about it, simply reparenting things to a scroll view is not exactly going to change their position. And I probably want to change the position. Reason being is I don't want to just drop it anywhere. I want it to automatically snap in place. So I'm going to add a child underneath the scroll view. I can do this by right-clicking, create, and I'm going to create a grid. A grid component essentially makes it easy to arrange things in a grid-like pattern. So if I was to select all three of these sprites, drop it underneath the grid, and right-click on the grid and say execute, it will actually arrange the sprites according to the cell width and height that I've specified. And there's some overlapping, so I'm going to specify 256. Try this again. Yeah, that's better. Of course, I can position it better. Now that I've done that, I'm going to go back to the window and specify the grid as the reparent target rather than the scroll view. You know what? I hate having to modify three of these things. I'm just going to make this into a prefab. Drag drop test, drop it into the Atlas folder for the time being. And for these guys, I'm just going to duplicate, say 4 times, grid, right click, execute, positions everything correctly. Okay, so the scripts for this particular instance, I don't need the center on click, so I'm going to kill it. But I do need drag and drop item script that I just added. And for the restriction, I'm actually going to specify vertical, which means that it will be possible to initiate the drag moving up and down, but it will not work when I'm moving left or right, which is ideal in this case because I'm trying to scroll the scroll view when moving left or right. So reset the scale, apply on a prefab, and unless I forgot something, it should be possible to drag it. Yep. Now, while it is possible to drag it, it essentially does not leave the scroll view's area per se, not visual anyway, and that's because I also need to add the drag and drop route. Essentially, when the dragged item begins its operation, it has the option to reparent itself so that it is actually located somewhere else while you're dragging it, rather than where it was. It is good for things like dragging items out of their scroll view, for example, which is what we're trying to do here. So drag and drop route can be placed just anywhere, but ideally it should be on a panel that is actually higher in depth. Now, to explain this better, everything in NGUI is sorted by depth, by widget depth or by panel depth. Panel supersedes widget depth, so if you have two different panels and one panel has a depth of 0 and another has a depth of 1, it doesn't matter what depth the widgets have inside of it. Panel will always matter more. So let's go ahead and create a new panel so that we actually have something on top. I'm going to select the UI, actually Windows is fine, right click, create a panel. Now that I have a panel and its depth is actually by default 2 because it's just as 1, it is actually going to be on top. So all that's missing is drag and drop root script on it. And now if I actually hit play, it'll be possible to drag this item outside of the scroll view. And when I release, it will return back to the scroll view. To make it easier to see, I'm going to select the grid and check the Animate Smoothly checkbox, which means that the grid will not snap back into place when something changes, but instead will do it smoothly. So hit play, move the item outside. It's more interesting. Let's add another control here. A horizontal scroll bar. I'm just gonna use a simple horizontal scroll bar is fine. If I just position it anywhere and select the scroll view to use it, here I actually have two choices, horizontal scroll bar and a vertical scroll bar. I'm just gonna drag and drop the horizontal scroll bar and have it show up only when it's actually needed. Now if I hit play, I can use the scroll bar to scroll through the scroll view and have it reflect changes accordingly. I'm just going to parent it to the window itself. To make it a bit more interesting, I'm going to duplicate this entire object and then see what happens. If I drag the item from one place and drop it in another, it actually gets transferred correctly. Now I have all of them in one panel. But it's not returning. That's because there is no collider. Let's fix that. The window itself can use a box collider, so it actually is able to receive events. Same thing here. Attach box collider. Let's try this again. Yeah, now it works. So there you have it. Now you have two scroll views, and it's possible to drag and drop items from one to the other, and both of them are resizable. You can also make this window draggable by giving it a drag object script. Drag object script can also be used to move objects around, but in this case we'll just specify the window itself as the target. Right now, if you actually hit play, it will be possible to move the window around. If you wanted to restrict this draggable window to always be on screen at all times, you can check this Keep Visible checkbox. And now when you actually do that and attempt to drag it outside of the window's dimensions, you will notice that it snaps back in place. Using the content rectangle dimensions of your choice. In this case, it just references itself, its own sprite. If you wanted to specify larger dimensions, just add an invisible widget. To do that, just add it as a child. Right-click, create an invisible widget. Now I can drag it around to specify the dimensions that I want it to be. Say this, for example. This pretty much envelops everything. And now I just specify this container that I just created as the content rectangle. Now if I hit play again and attempt to drag it outside, you'll notice that the scroll bar will now stay on the screen because it is within the contents rectangle. Okay, well, this video is just about 40 minutes long, so I think it's pretty long as it is, and I'm gonna wrap this up. I just wanted to remind you guys that you can always right-click on an NGUI component and select the help option, and then navigate to a specific component and get help for that. Well, that's about it for me. Thanks for watching yet another NGUI tutorial. Hopefully it answers some of your questions, and see you guys next time.